story.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
And so, Father, I would like to thank you for his life and his contribution.
A sermon from a preacher in a Soweto church his father built. Frank Chikane's links to the township lie deep, as do his roots in the long struggle against apartheid here in South Africa and the new democracy that emerged at the end of it. A former head of the World Council of Churches, he was at different times imprisoned, tortured and issued with a series of banning orders by the white regime. On the rare occasion he was allowed to leave the country, he came close to death after being poisoned by a state-sanctioned hit team. He was one of the founders of the United Democratic Front, an umbrella body that spearheaded the internal fight against white domination throughout the tempestuous 1980s. And then he became part of the country's first democratic government as Director General in the office of Nelson Mandela's deputy, Thabo Mbeki.
So I help people.
He stayed in that post when Mbeki succeeded Mandela as president. Frank Chikane played a central role in formulating the economic and social policies of the African National Congress as it moved from resistance movement to government, but has now moved away from mainstream politics and has assumed the job his father held as pastor of the Apostolic Faith Mission Church in Naledi, Soweto. The Reverend Chikane remains a member of the ANC, but has become the fiercest internal critic of its failures in governance, the loudest of a growing number of voices questioning the direction the liberation movement has taken and concerned about his country's future post-Mandela. Reverend Frank Chikane, thank you for joining us. You said prayers for Nelson Mandela, as did many in South Africa. Why is he so important, do you think, in the country's national psyche?
Yeah, you know, Mandela is a unique person. He made great sacrifices for this country. He did something extraordinary that not many people would do, including spending 27 years in jail, being tortured, being persecuted, and he endured all that and still came out and was able to stand for peace and reconciliation. And that's why people love him. And I mean, we could not have crossed the bridge we crossed without people like Mandela. I always said, when he gets released, we need him for at least the first 2 to 5 years to be able to cross the bridge, because otherwise we could have destroyed each other. And Madiba did exactly that.
Is there an element perhaps too that he represented a promise that might not have been realized, people looking back at a past and the promises of that past as symbolized within Mandela? Is there an element of that too?
No, I think the opposite would be true. I think Mandela represents the issues of peace, reconciliation, living together, both blacks and whites. And I think we have achieved that in terms of just relationships. I think what is outstanding, which is a challenge, it's the economy. And we started whilst he was there to transform the economy, restructure the budget of the country, restructure state assets. And with Mbeki on the transformation of society, we did our best. But until now, we still have poverty that should not be with us. We have high levels of unemployment. We have a huge gap between the rich and the poor, which has to do with the history of this country. And those are the major issues that affect the people. I think I would say for whites and the international community, there is this fear about if Mandela goes, something wrong will go. I don't believe that anything is going to go wrong here. I think the challenge we have doesn't necessarily need Mandela. It needs us as South Africans to face the reality that if we don't do something very radical, the young people are going to revolt.
I mean, put briefly, is the South Africa that we have today the South Africa that you, Nelson Mandela, so many millions of others fought for?
I would say yes and no. You know, the yes part is I'm able to live as a human being. I'm able to live here without fear. I'm able to be recognized as a full citizen of this country. For those of us who come from the old days, where even the bench you have to sit on has to be labeled to white and blacks, you can't go to a park, can't go through the front door of a shop. I mean, those who come from that experience, something radical has happened. But I would say no, because the economic side of it has not been achieved. Our objectives about an equitable society, a society where everybody will be able to have bread on their table. We're not talking about millionaires, we're not talking about billionaires, we're just talking about a rich country like South Africa, where there should be no single person who sleeps without food. And this, to me, is the greatest challenge.
I just want to take you back 30 years, the launch of the United Democratic Front, an umbrella resistance body to apartheid that essentially replaced the African National Congress that was banned within the country at the moment. Now, the principles of that organization, non-racism, full rights for human beings, you've described it in your writing as the critical turning point in the battle against apartheid and the transformation of this society. Do you think it's time for another turning point like that? Another stage within the society's development where everything is looked at anew?
I think we have reached that stage. I think the biggest challenge is that you need a movement that will be based on the principles which motivated us at that time. The principles were about the liberation of the people, freedom of the people, changing the quality of lives of people. It was not about ourselves. It was never about individual interests. And I think as years went by, once we are in government, we are being challenged by what is called the sins of incumbency. Once you are in government, some things change, people change character, they begin to look at life in terms of their self-interest rather than the interests of the people. I think that has come out very clearly, that the leaders we require are leaders like Mandela, Sisulu, who were there for the people and not for themselves. I think that's critical. But having said that, the economic challenge still remains, and I still feel we need to go back to the drawing boards, because at the beginning, we thought blacks and whites together will deal with the legacy of apartheid and make sure we change the country together. But somehow, after Mr. de Klerk left Parliament, you have this type of feeling that whites in the country have folded their arms, wait for this black government to change the country. Now, I argue, you can't use taxpayers' money only to change the country. You need people who own capital, who own assets, who are able to make a difference in the economy, because it's not just government. Government doesn't run business. And I think that's where we need to put our hands together once more again, blacks and whites, and say, how do we change this economy in a way that it will create jobs for people, it will open opportunities, it will give birth to new entrepreneurs. And so there are many challenges that are facing us. And indeed, yeah, it's time for us to go back to the drawing boards.
And yet, throughout that period, you say that it can't be left only to governments, but you have had the African National Congress in power for this 2 decades. To what extent must it accept responsibility, both in terms of failures within its leadership and in terms of failures within its policy? To what extent is it responsible for this economic stasis that you refer to?
I would say, obviously, there are many factors which create this type of a crisis. Indeed, there are weaknesses. I was in government. I know some of the weaknesses. Some have to do with who do you appoint to do a job. And if that person doesn't have the relevant skill, they are not going to be able to achieve their objectives. Even if you had the money, you will not be able to achieve those objectives. But we also pushed it to a level where it became clear you've got shortage of skills. If you take, say, a local government in a rural area where there's no engineer at all, who's prepared to go and work in that place, then you know that without skills, you will not be able to meet the requirements and the needs of the people. So there is an element which is leaders who make mistakes about who they appoint to do a job. There is also an element of lack of skills, which you require to cause the changes. Then there is an element of capital. In some instances where you've got effective management, you've got skilled people, then you'll have a crisis of money to be able to meet those requirements. I have a feeling that it's both, really. And in terms of the economy, it's not a party that changes an economy. It's not the government. You can create the framework, and I think we did create the framework, but business has not gone in to play the game. If you want to play the game of high returns, then you are playing it against the poor, actually, and you'll not produce the results too. You need a Marshall Plan. That's what I usually say. You know, Europe after the war, you needed a Marshall Plan that's not just based on market forces. You needed to put money, change the conditions, improve the quality of infrastructure. Once you've done that, then people can fly on their own. I think we never had that opportunity to do that type of thing.
And yet you were part of a government, the Mbeki government,
from
Thabo
Mandela's
Mbeki.
time.
Yes,
from
Thabo Mbeki,
Mandela's
the
time
successor
to
of Nelson Mandela. But specifically, the Mbeki government looked very hard at the economic systems, at transforming an economy. And yet, those who pushed that system, people like Thabo Mbeki himself, fell into disfavor with the organization itself because it was not in line, many within the organization, the ANC argued, with fundamental ANC policy. So you had the opportunity to start the engine, but it was the party that stopped it.
No, but that's where I differ. I mean, those people who say Mbeki followed particular policies which were not liked by the party, I would say they are wrong. Actually, the policies we followed, I was there. I translated the manifesto of the ANC to government policy. I worked with government specialists to do that. We worked within the framework of the ANC. The removal of Mbeki, as I say in my book, 8 days, has nothing to do with policies. It has nothing to do with successes or failures of government. It had to do purely with politics within the ANC, and I've indicated that it has to do with problems which arose affecting the deputy president of the ANC, who was deputy president of the country at that time.
We're speaking about Jacob Zuma.
And his removal. The Mbeki's removal had to do with those dynamics. It has nothing to do with, I think in terms of policy, in terms of efforts, we did our best. And what we need now, it's not the grants, it's not the RDP houses, it's not those things that needed to be done at that moment. Is to give people the capacity to live.
Yet there does seem to be a reluctance to take criticism from the ruling party, from the African National Congress. Your latest book, Things That Can't Be Said, has received a lot of criticism from certain government circles because what you would regard as very constructive and what I saw as very constructive criticism and analysis of what went wrong and what should go right is interpreted by some within the ANC as an attack on the organization itself. Is it that thin-skinned at this particular point?
Yeah, no, the good thing is that they've not said it to me. They say it elsewhere. So in fact, what I'm saying in this book and the previous one is that we need to cleanse ourselves. And it is in protection of the ANC and its national democratic revolution, as we have coined it within the ANC, that we want change. And the change, success, will be measured by whether or not blacks and whites are living a normal life where you can never identify poverty with color. In the ANC, it's critical because it is the ruling party, and some would say, no, it's not the ruling party, it's a governing party. Okay, it's governing, it takes responsibility, and we should not allow corrupt people to distort reality, delay the changes, retard the progress, and rob the poor, because the corrupt rob the poor. And that's what my stance is, and it will remain the same. And I've challenged everybody. I've said, tell me what policy of ANC or government I've violated in the books. There is no such a thing. I'm within the framework. If you are corrupt, don't blame me. If you are the obstacle to change, don't blame me, because you shouldn't be in that position in the first place. So that's my position, and I hold it. And I believe people died for our freedom, and we can't treat it like people didn't lose their lives. If people who died would come back today and look at it and say, is it what I really wanted, died for? I'm sure some people will regret. There are older comrades here, veterans who are passing away now. I keep on saying those who passed away in the 90s, went away happy, because, we're at the height of the change, the excitement, the celebration. Now, those who are going away are concerned about where are we going as a country. And we can't have the few enriching themselves at the expense of the poor. You can't. And in a poor country, corruption affects the people much more than in a rich country. I mean, there's corruption in the United States, but I'm sure people don't feel it. And it might be even in larger scales than we know of. But people don't feel it because they've got lots of money. But where a road is critical for people to go to work, or you need a bus, or you need a train, and you fail to do it, it means people are not able to live a normal life. If there's no road to go to a clinic, how does an ambulance reach the people in the townships where there is no road to go there? It's critical when you are poor, and you can't pocket money to do roads and enrich yourselves and then impoverish people even more. That's really my position. And I'm still looking for a person who's going to tell me what I'm talking about is unacceptable.
You mentioned there that issue about poverty being demarcated by race.
Yeah.
Now, just to go back once again to the whole foundation of the African National Congress, of groups like the UDF, was the concept of non-racism.
Yeah.
Now, this is the idea that there is total equality, that it is a society that is in effect colorblind. And yet, 20 years into democracy, we still have, as you say, a demarcation of poverty that is very largely drawn along racial lines. How dangerous is this?
It is. That's why I'm saying it will result in a revolution. Wait and look at the numbers of unemployed. The older generation, less numbers of unemployed. The younger they become, the higher the graph goes about the unemployed. If we keep it like that, you can be sure it's a recipe for another revolution. And nobody must actually fail to understand that. We have to change it, especially if it expresses itself in the form of color. I mean, it's still like that. I crossed the lines. You can see that you know that I go live with the people in the townships. I've got a congregation there. I interact with the poor in those townships, and I still work in high places as well and end up in 5-star hotels and even hotels more than 5 stars. And you can see it. The higher the stars go, the more black people disappear. And by the time you reach the top hotel, there are more whites there than you can see blacks. It tells you, even in terms of just wealth, you can look at it, you'll find it. We have to change it. Now, we don't have to blame anybody. And that's where I agree with Trevor Manuel. Apartheid has caused a disaster. We need to work hard to change it. And the economic policies are the ones we need to structure in a way that produces that effect. And I'm quite convinced you don't have to force people. I think we need to do it the way we did it in '94. Come together, say, let's fix it together. It's in the interest of whites and blacks. It's in the interest of the rich and the poor to work together to change this color line which defines our lives. And even residential areas, for instance, the more poorer people are, they become more black. It's historical. So it's a challenge. I don't think the ANC alone can solve that problem. It must be the whole of the nation that does it.
You mentioned Trevor Manuel, who's the National Planning Minister of South Africa, and who recently said it is time to stop blaming apartheid for all the current ills of the society.
Yeah, for the failures.
For the failures.
Now that is a
very important acknowledgement, and some would argue that it's very late in coming from the organization itself and from successive governments, which have to a large degree said we are dealing with the failures created by apartheid.
Yeah.
Is there a time that we stop?
I would say we are dealing with a legacy, which is an apartheid legacy. It means the fact that people stay here, it's a legacy of apartheid. To change it, it's a big challenge. I think what Trevor is talking about is if we fail to do the things we intended to do, we shouldn't blame apartheid. If you've got a program and it's not happening, if you've got a road you must construct and it's not happening, don't blame apartheid. And that's where I argue. Those who are corrupt are the ones who delay the process because you divert the resources to enrich individuals instead of getting to deal with the challenges people are facing.
Are you referring to specifically corruption within the governing party or on a wider basis?
So not the wider basis. It affects the governing party. But you know, corruption, it's a two-way route. It's business and party and government. They are all, I mean, when you corrupt people, you work within that system. And I think it's a fallacy to say the only people who are corrupt are in the ANC. I don't think it's true. The point is the ANC as the governing party must make sure that the resources voted for to change the lives of people don't end up in people's pockets. It is its responsibility because it is the government. And I think that's where my critique would stand. Yeah.
Finally, you mentioned the word cleansing.
Yeah.
You said the need now for the society to cleanse itself, to move forward. Is the society able to, both within the government and within the society as a whole, the degree of anger, the degree of frustration, is there the capacity to cleanse, do you believe?
Yeah, you know, I in one of the book launches I did, I put it in Zulu that we need abo Mandela gufa. You know, people who are ready to sacrifice themselves, because that's where we come from. Today, if you speak critically like I do, you then lose your job, or you don't get appointed for anything, or you get interfered with in terms of creative things you want to do, even in the private sector. You get affected in trying to get a job in the private sector because the private sector will say, if I appoint you, then the government may be negative about my company, therefore I'm not going to appoint you. There are costs to take a stand. And I'm convinced the only way we can clean the system is to have sufficient number of people who will take a stand, which will be such that those who are corrupt would know that they will lose the election. Because if you mobilize the masses against the corrupt, then they will lose an election and they will be forced to change. I don't think anybody will change voluntarily, especially those who are beneficiaries. There are people who benefit out of chaos. In fact, they love it. There are people who benefit out of war. They make money. And if you stop a war, they lose money. And so I think that's where the challenge is. And many people now are scared. And this is what worries me about our democracy. They are scared of taking a stand. And I'm saying if we don't do it, our democracy is gone. What we fought for, it's going to be lost forever. So it is important to take the same stand we took in the face of adversity. We took a stand, people died, but we won. And even now, I think we need people like those.
Reverend Frank Chikane, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.